Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into something pretty serious, a kind of silent crisis happening beneath the surface, the threat to freshwater ecosystems globally.
That's right. It's easy to think of, rainforests or reefs when we talk about endangered species. But freshwater life, it's actually among the most endangered on the planet.
Yeah, they're dealing with pollution, habitat loss, climate change. It's a lot, and a huge piece of that puzzle, maybe bigger than many realize, is invasive species.
Specifically, non-native invasive fish. These newcomers are increasingly recognized as major drivers of extinction threats in these vulnerable systems.
So for today's deep dive, we're focusing on a really key paper that helps unpack this. It's called Ecological Impacts of Non-Native Freshwater Fishes by Julian Cucherousset and Julian D. Olden.
Yeah, it's a synthesis piece. They basically pulled together a decade's worth of research, this was from 1999 to 2009, to give a clearer picture of just how these invasive fish cause problems.
And they look at it from all angles, right? From the tiniest genetic level all the way up to the entire ecosystem. They call these the levels of biological organization, or LBOs.
Exactly, and understanding this is crucial. Why? Because the rate we're introducing non-native species is actually speeding up.
So if you're trying to manage a river or lake or make policy,
You absolutely need to grasp the full range of impacts. It's not just one thing, it's a cascade of effects. This paper really aims to lay that out.
okay, let's get into it. They looked at 75 key studies from that decade. What did they find just about the research itself? How are people even studying this?
Well, I split the studies into two main camps. Experimental, where scientists actively manipulated things in the environment, in situ.
Like adding or removing fish in controlled areas.
Right. And then observational studies, which are more about field surveys, tracking where fish are and what happens naturally.
And what jumped out?
A really significant bias. The research wasn't evenly spread, not at all.
Bias how? Like focusing on certain places or certain fish?
Both, actually.
Mm.
Geographically, but also taxonomically. Certain groups get way more attention.
Which ones?
Big surprise, right? Salmon and trout, the Salmonidae. They accounted for almost 36% of the studies.
Ah, the ones people like to fish for.
Exactly. And then Centrarchidae, that's your sunfish and bass, they were nearly 18%. So yeah, we know a lot about the impacts concerning popular sport fish.
But much less about maybe less charismatic or economically important native species that might be suffering.
Precisely. Huge knowledge gaps there. And that bias extends to those levels of biological organization too.
The LBO bias. Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It means most studies looked at the individual level, things like growth rates, behavior shifts, or the population level, like are numbers going up or down.
Things you can more easily see and measure, I guess.
Yeah. Much less work was done on the deeper genetic consequences or the really broad ecosystem level changes, like nutrient cycling.
So, major blind spots. Okay, let's start digging into the impacts themselves, maybe starting small, at that micro level. Genetics in individuals. You mentioned that Atlantic salmon and rainbow trout example in Canada earlier.
Right. This one's fascinating because it's not just about direct fighting or eating the same food. The presence of the invasive rainbow trout actually messes with the native Atlantic salmon's social structure.
How so? It disrupts their dominance hierarchies.
Exactly.
Mm.
And they didn't just observe behavior. They used microarray technology.
Wow, so looking directly at gene activity in the brain.
Yeah. And what they found was that the invasive trout's presence caused the brain gene activity patterns of dominant and subordinate salmon to become more similar. It sort of flattened their distinct genetic profiles related to social status.
That's wild. It's like psychological warfare at the genetic level.
It really shows how deep these interactions can go. And besides that kind of stress response, the other big genetic threat is hybridization.
When natives and non-natives interbreed.
Right. And that can go a few ways. Mostly bad for the native species. First, it can just be wasted effort. Native fish waste eggs, or sperm trying to breed with invaders, reducing their own reproductive success. That's especially dangerous for populations that are already struggling.
Okay, wasted energy. What else?
Paradoxically, sometimes the hybrids are actually better adapted,
Hmm.
at least initially. It's called hybrid vigor.
Vigor sounds good, but I'm guessing it's not good for preserving the original native species.
Not at all. It's a threat to biodiversity. The paper mentions Pecos pupfish hybridizing with the invasive sheepshead minnow. The hybrids grew faster, swam better.
So they could potentially outcompete and replace the pure native pupfish.
Exactly. The successful hybrid spells doom for the unique native lineage. A really tough outcome.
Okay, moving up from genes to individual fish behavior. You mentioned invasive fish can be bullies.
Oh, definitely. Aggression and dominance are common tactics.
Mm-hmm.
Introduce bluegill, impacting native Sacramento perch.
What happens there?
The bluegills are aggressive, so the perch end up spending more time hiding in dense cover. They change their behavior.
Which means less time feeding.
Right.
Oh, wow.
That directly leads to slower growth rates for the native perch. They're surviving, maybe, but not thriving.
And what about those Atlantic salmon fry again? Didn't they have a weird behavioral shift too?
Yeah, when rainbow trout are around, the native salmon fry become more active during the day.
That seems counterintuitive. Wouldn't that make them more visible to predators?
That's the hypothesis. They shift their natural rhythm, likely making them much more vulnerable, possibly just to avoid interacting with the trout. It's a costly avoidance strategy.
And it's not just the big, obvious predators causing trouble. You mentioned the tiny mosquito fish, Gambusia.
Yeah, these little guys are everywhere, often introduced ages ago, supposedly, for mosquito control, but they can be quite nasty.
How so?
In Israel, for example, they were observed physically damaging endangered fire salamander larvae, nipping their tails. This reduced the larva's growth and their chances of even making it to metamorphosis.
Wow. And in California?
Similar story, different victim. They found mosquito fish reduce the growth rate of native red-leg frog tadpoles by a whopping 34%.
That's significant. And these impacts can ripple into things like parenting, right? The round goby and smallmouth bass example.
Absolutely. The round goby loves to eat fresh eggs. So researchers did this simulation. They temporarily removed a nest-guarding male smallmouth bass, mimicking like catch-and-release fishing.
And the gobies moved in?
Instantly. On average, they devoured about 2,000 embryos before the male bass could get back.
2,000? That's devastating.
It is. And then even when the male is there, he has to spend way more energy chasing these gobies away. It massively increases the cost of parental care, potentially lowering his future reproductive success too. It's a hidden energy drain.
Okay, so those are individual and genetic impacts. Let's scale up now population and community levels. You mentioned disease vectors.
Yeah, invaders don't just compete and predate. They often bring their own diseases and parasites.
Hmm.
A really stark example is the Asian tapeworm.
Bothriocephalus opsiricthetus. That sounds nasty.
It is. It probably came in with introduced grass carp or bait fish. Now it's widespread in places like the U.S. Southwest.
And it harms native fish.
Severely. It can be fatal to various life stages, including some already endangered desert fish species, so it's another huge pressure point.
But the paper wasn't all doom and gloom, right? There was some mention of resilience.
Yes, particularly in ecosystems that were naturally fishless to begin with, like some high mountain lakes.
Where trout were introduced for fishing but didn't belong.
Exactly. In those cases, introduced salmonids hammered amphibians, like the mountain yellow-legged frog. But, and this is the hopeful part, when they experimentally removed the fish,
The frogs bounced back.
they bounced back surprisingly quickly. Within just a few years, the population showed strong recovery. It shows that sometimes, if you can remove the primary stressor, these systems can be quite resilient. Restoration can work.
That's good to hear. But then there's the flip side, the really drastic community impact extinction. There's one case study that always comes up.
Lake Victoria.
Yeah.
The introduction of the Nile perch, late Snelloticus.
Introduced deliberately, wasn't it, for fishing?
It was, back in the 1960s, to boost the commercial fishery. The ecological cost, though, was catastrophic.
How bad was it?
The perch is a huge predator. It basically ate its way through the lake's incredible diversity of native cichlid fish. Hundreds of species found nowhere else on Earth.
How many are we talking?
Conservative estimates are that between 150 and 200 endemic fish species vanished. That's roughly 60% of the lake's unique fish fauna wiped out.
Gone.
It's often called the greatest vertebrate extinction known in recent times. A direct result of that one introduction. It's staggering.
Beyond outright extinction, there's a more subtle, maybe insidious long-term effect they mention. Biotic homogenization. What's that about?
It's this trend where ecosystems across the globe start looking more similar in terms of the species they contain.
Because the same few successful invasive species pop up everywhere.
Exactly. You get these globally common invaders, like common carp, mosquito fish, certain sunfish, replacing the unique, locally evolved native species.
So distinct regional faunas get blurred.
Right. The paper cited data from the U.S. showing that states which historically had 0 fish species in common now share, on average, over 25 species.
Wow.
Yeah, and similar trends in places like Australia. It's a worldwide loss of biological uniqueness.
Okay, let's move to the broadest scale. The entire ecosystem. How do these fish change the fundamental workings of lakes and rivers?
One major way is by altering food webs, often through what we call trophic cascades, introducing a new top predator, for instance.
Like the smallmouth bass example.
Yeah, in lakes where they invaded, they decimated the smaller native fish that live near the shore, the littoral prey fish.
So the native predators, like lake trout, had to switch food sources.
Exactly. The lake trout were forced to shift their diet away from those nearshore fish towards eating more zooplankton, tiny organisms out in the open water.
Why does that matter for the whole lake? It sounds like just a diet change.
Because it changes where the energy flows. They stopped relying as much on energy produced near the shore, what scientists call littoral-derived carbon, and started relying more on open water energy pathways.
Hmm.
That fundamentally rejigs the whole lake's energy budget and food web structure.
Interesting. And they can mess with nutrient cycles too, like making the water greener.
Definitely. Fish like Nile tilapia are really good at this. Through their waste excretion, they release a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus into the water.
Which acts like fertilizer for algae.
Precisely. It can fuel massive algal blooms, leading to eutrophication, that state where the water gets choked with algae, oxygen levels drop, and other life suffers.
Is there evidence of this?
Yeah, they mentioned a striking case in a Brazilian reservoir. There was a massive die-off of introduced tilapia, and guess what happened?
Water quality improved.
Dramatically. Clearer water, significant drops in chlorophyll and phosphorus levels. It was like a natural experiment showing the impact the fish were having just by living and excreting.
Okay, and what about disrupting energy between ecosystems? That sounds complex.
Think about fish that migrate, like anadromous fish shad, salmon that swim from the ocean into freshwater rivers to spawn.
They bring nutrients from the sea inland, right?
Exactly. When they die after spawning, their bodies decompose and release marine-derived nutrients, which are super important for the health of the river and even the surrounding land, the riparian zone.
So invaders can interfere with that delivery service.
Yes, the paper talks about large introduced catfish like blue catfish or Wells catfish that heavily prey on these migrating shad. Sometimes shad make up like 40 to 65% of their diet.
So fewer shad complete their journey, meaning fewer marine nutrients reach the freshwater system.
That's the consequence. They're intercepting that crucial energy flow between ocean and river.
And there's another example, right? Affecting spiders.
Yeah, that was an interesting one. Introduced rainbow trout in Japan caused native char to change their diet, eating more bottom-dwelling insects.
Okay.
So fewer of those insects emerge from the stream as adults. And those adult insects are food for riparian predators, like certain spiders that specialize in catching them. The study found the density of those specialist spiders dropped by 65%.
Wow, a fish invasion impacts spiders on the riverbank. That's a true cascade.
It really highlights how interconnected these systems are. And finally, some fish are actual ecosystem engineers. They physically change the habitat.
The classic example being...
Common carp, Cyprinus carpio, they're famous for it. They root around in the bottom sediments looking for food bioturbation, it's called.
stirring everything up.
Constantly. They uproot aquatic plants, suspend sediment in the water. This can shift a clear water lake or pond to a permanently turbid, muddy state. That changes everything. Light penetration, plant growth, the whole character of the water body.
So looking back at all these impacts, genetic, individual, population, community, ecosystem, well, it's a lot. And mostly negative.
Overwhelmingly so. The picture Cucherousset and Olden paint is complex, but the trend is clear. Non-native fish introductions have profound, often damaging consequences across all biological scales.
Which brings us to their final section, the prospectus. What did they say is the biggest takeaway for people actually trying to manage these situations?
They state what they call the greatest truism in invasion biology. Once an invasive species is established, especially fish in large connected water bodies, it's usually there to stay.
Eradication is basically impossible or causes too much collateral damage.
Pretty much. Which means job number one has to be prevention. Stopping them from getting there in the first place. That remains the absolute cornerstone.
But introductions keep happening, so managers are stuck dealing with these mixed systems, natives and non-natives living together.
Right. And that's where the science needs to step up. The paper lays out 5 critical areas for future research to help reduce uncertainty for managers and policymakers.
What are the key ones?
Well, first, addressing those biases we talked about. We desperately need more research on the impacts in less studied regions and on less charismatic species, not just trout and bass in North America and Europe.
Makes sense. Broaden the scope.
Second, get a more balanced view across all those levels of biological organization. We need to understand the genetic and ecosystem level consequences much better. They've been relatively neglected.
What else?
They also stress combining different research approaches. We need both controlled experiments to understand the mechanisms of impact and observational studies to see how things play out in the real complex world.
And importantly, understanding adaptation.
Yes, that's crucial. How are native species adapting or failing to adapt evolutionarily to these new invaders? And how are the invaders themselves changing? We need to get a handle on the evolutionary dynamics.
And finally, how these invasions interact with other problems.
Exactly. Climate change, habitat degradation, pollution.
Mm-hmm.
These things aren't happening in isolation. How do invasive species impacts add to, or maybe even multiply, the effects of these other stressors? That's a huge question for the future.
It really underscores the complexity. Invasive fish aren't just another species in the mix. They're actively rewriting the ecological and even evolutionary rules of the ecosystems they enter.
Absolutely. The impacts are profound and reshape everything from water chemistry to the long-term trajectory of native populations.
So wrapping this up, the paper makes it clear that prevention is key, but often fails, and eradication is rarely feasible.
Which leaves us in a challenging position.
So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, building on that idea of adaptation the paper raised. Given that we often can't get rid of established invaders, how much should we focus on, well, helping native species cope?
It's interesting. Shifting focus.
Yeah. Instead of pouring all resources into fighting the invader, could we, or should we, be thinking more about how to bolster the resilience of native species, maybe even trying to accelerate their beneficial evolutionary responses to these new pressures?
A shift from pure eradication towards fostering resilience and adaptation.
Yeah.
That's definitely a provocative idea to mull over.
Huh.
How do we manage for coexistence in these permanently changed ecosystems?
So to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.